Hello and welcome back to Tech Route. Now, I'm sure as web developers, we've all had situations where certain CSS styles we apply to our web page end up not showing, and we can't really figure out why this is happening. We often spend hours and minutes trying to debug this issue, and sometimes we are forced to use the important flag to override and enforce the browser to actually show up our styles. Now, we all know that this is bad practice, and today we'll be going through the rules of CSS specificity and how the browser reconciles our style to ensure that a particular style is shown up on our web page. Also, we'll be walking through most of the CSS selectors out there and their implication, thereby making styling a much easier job for us as web developers. This video will generally help us improve our skills as web developers. For those that stay to the end of this video, I'll be showing us a cheat sheet that will serve as a guide for us whenever we need to look up the various CSS selectors out there. Now, with that being said, if you've not subscribed to TechRoute yet, I'll encourage you to do that now, and let's get right into it. Now, when we talk about CSS selectors, these are basically ways to target certain HTML elements on the DOM to enable us to apply things like styles to them. Now, when we now talk about how specific an element is, we're talking about CSS specificity, which is basically an algorithm used by the browser to determine which CSS tag or rule it should apply. Now, the browser does this by using the score approach. Basically, it keeps scores of 3 columns primarily, the first column being the ID column, the middle column being the class column, and the last column being the element type column. Now, what the browser does is compare the score and determine which one is higher. The element or the selector with the highest score is eventually applied to the browser. Now, once two selectors have the same score, basically what the browser does is look for the last styling that was applied or the last selector that was used to style, and then the browser goes ahead to apply that style to our web page. Now, this is basically a diagram just to show how this works. This is just basically the heading for CSS specificity, and then these are the columns. We have the first column with a weighted score of 0. We have the middle column, which is a class selector with 0 also, and then we have the element type selectors with a score of 0 also. Now, when we talk about, I'll zoom in a bit. Now, when we talk about ID selectors, we are talking about basically using the ID of the element. Now, what this does, or the effect of this is, it gives us a 100 score value. Now, when we talk about the class selector, we're talking about things like classes we create, and we're talking about things like attributes. We're also talking about things like pseudo-classes. Now, what the browser does is it weighs this as 0, 1, 0. So once the browser detects that what is selected, or the selector we are using is a class selector, or is a class column selector, it adds 1 to the middle column. Now, we talk about the element type selectors. Now, basically, these are like spans, your P element, your H1 element, basically targeting the HTML element, the name of or the type of the HTML element to style it. And this also includes pseudo elements like before and after pseudo elements. And I think usually it also includes every pseudo element that comes with 2 colons before the name. Now, the implication of this is the browser has a 0, 0, 1 value to it. So the last column gets a 1. But of course, it goes to show you that the last column has the least weight or importance. The middle column is on the middle, and then the ID selectors have the highest value. So if I have 3 selectors where I'm selecting an ID, I'm selecting a class, and then I'm selecting an element type, of course, that of the ID would supersede all of them. Now, there are also selectors that are called no value selectors. That means when these selectors are applied, basically what happens is we still end up having a situation where we have 0, 0, and 0. Because these are 0 value selectors, they have no weight when we talk about specificity. Now, what this does basically for us is allow us to easily override the styles that are applied here. So whatever style we apply on the universal selector, or when we use the where pseudo condition, whatever style we apply here has 0 weight, and as such, it can easily be overridden by any of the three column selectors we have here. Now we also have combinators. This allow us combine 2 or 3 selectors or even more selectors to achieve certain results, or to ensure that we specifically pick the elements we want to style. And this is also similar to the is, the has, and the not pseudo conditionals. Basically what this does is it has 0 value in terms of weight, but whatever selector you use along this combinator, along these combinators or these pseudo conditionals, what it does is it retains the value of that selector. Say for example, I have a class selector used with either a combinator or any of the pseudo conditionals. What happens is the weight would be the weight of the class selector that was used, or the element type selectors that was used. Would clearly see this when we actually go into the real implementation shortly, but this is just an overview to give us an idea of how this works behind the scene. So to get started, we have a basic HTML page set up here. This is just a simple boilerplate. You can simply add this if you want this. I would also have a link to the code on the description. And we'll have the style inline here. The idea of having the style inline is just to allow us see a preview of what we are doing in real time, the styles, the HTML elements, and also the browser window. Also, you can have this open on your browser window by simply using the live server extension, which is what I am currently using, and then you can just open it up on the web page. Now, with that being said, we can go ahead and get started. The first selector we'll be looking at today would be the universal selector, which is usually done with a star. So I can go ahead and say color and just apply a color to this. Now, once I save, we see that everything on the page has accepted this style as the color. I can go ahead and make it something clearer. So we see that every element on the page has actually accepted this style. Now, the next selector we would want to look at is the element type selector. Now, remember I mentioned that the element type selector has a score of 1. So once we are using the element style selector, of course, it has a higher specificity compared to the universal selector. So I'll just go ahead and select every span on the page and make the color blue. Now, once I do that and save, you see that the color of every span on the page has successfully been changed to blue. Again, remember I mentioned that when 2 scores are equal, the browser simply picks the one that comes last. So I would go ahead and move this up so that you see that these styles are applied not because it comes last, but because it has a higher score. So if I save this, you see that all spans are also still blue, even though this universal selector comes last. So I'll just go ahead and revert that. Also, to show us a proof for this, VS Code also gives us a nice preview of what the specificity is. So you can see selector specificity is 001, and you can see the universal selector is 000. It has no score. Now, with that being said, the next selector we would want to look at is the class selector. Now, we can basically use the class selector by prefixing a dot and then the name of the class. So we can call it maybe text, and then we can go ahead and say color on the text should be green. Now, all we have to do is go to the exact elements we want to apply this to and add a class and say class text. Once I save this, you see that this is now green. Now, the good thing about class selectors, which is the selector we often use the most, is you can apply this class to multiple elements, thereby reusing the styles on the class. So I can go ahead and come here and say class text, and then this will just simply change this to green. Now, again, if I go ahead and apply this class to the span text, you see that the span will change. When I save this, the span will change to the color green. So you see now the span is now the color green. Now this is happening because, of course, the class selector has a higher specificity compared to the span, to the element type selector. Now I can go ahead and move this up, and you see that we still get the same effect, nothing changes. Now when I hover on this, you see that the class selector has a score of 0, 1, 0, which is definitely higher than the element type selector. Now, the next selector we want to look at is the ID selector. Now, we do this by prefixing a hash and then the name of the ID, maybe my ID. Then we can go ahead and say color should be red. Now, all you have to do is come here and set the ID to the ID you created, which is my ID. Now, once I save this, you see that the color has changed to red. Again, the ID selector has the highest specificity. If I hover on this, you see that the score is 100. Now, if I copy this ID class and simply add it to the text here, you will see that when I save this, the color of this text will change to red because, of course, ID has a higher score compared to any of the selectors we've covered so far. So when I save this, you see that the color of the text is now red. Regardless of where this is on the web page, if I bring this down, you see that the color is also still the same red. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier was when two scores are equal, what the browser basically does is it selects the later score. Now, we can add multiple classes, so I can go ahead here and add another class, maybe. Now, I can call this light. So maybe a lighter version. I can go ahead here and select the class light and make the color black. Now, when I save this, you will see that the color, the class lights with color black would not be applied until I take out this ID here. Now, when I save this, you see that the color would go ahead and change to black. So you see that the text is now black. Now, why is this happening? If I moved this up, because of course they are both class selectors and they have the same score. So if I move this up, the implication is this is 010 and this is also 010. So if I move this up, the implication is the last true will always apply, which means green will apply. So if I save this, you see that it's now green instead of being black. So I think that's that for the first basic selectors. And this is most likely 30% of all the CSS selectors you would ever have to use. Now, the next set of selectors we'll be looking at are selectors that allows combine more than one selector. So basically, this will be a combination of selectors. So we can go ahead and clear this up. Now, the first selector we'll look at is basically combining more than one selector and styling them at a time. So we can go ahead and select all the li elements on the page and then put a comma and add another element selector, basically all the p elements on the page. And then we can also select the text, all the classes of text on the page, and go ahead and apply a color brown to them. Now, when I save this, you see that everything selected, everything has an li on the page, everything has a p on the page, and everything that has the class text on the page, we apply the color brown to them. Now, when it comes to this, the highest selector here is the class selector, and they all stand alone. So when I hover on this, you see that this is 010. They all maintain their own individual specificity. It doesn't change. Now, the next one we want to look at is basically being able to combine two selectors together without using a space. So I can say, go ahead and select all P elements and put the color to be blue. Now, but when I do this, you see that we have more than one P element on the page, and this has a color blue. Also, this has a color blue. But I can then go ahead and say, since I know this one has a class of text and light, I can take off this class. Since I know this has a class of text, I can go ahead and say select every P element on the page with a class of text. So basically, I'm not adding a space to it. I'm just adding the dots text, which is the name of the class. Now, when I save this, you see that only one text is currently selected. Now, if you think about it in terms of the implication of the score, it's basically we combining two elements. So what happens is we look at the weight score for an element type selector and the weight score for a class selector. So that would give us a 0, 1, 0. So when I hover, just to write this out here, this is a 0, 1, 1, because it's going to give us a 0, 1, 1 because, of course, this is an element. This is a class and this is an element type, which are the two things we have. So when I hover on this, you see that it gives you a score of 0, 1, 1, and then the color changes to blue. Now, the next selector we would want to look at is basically combining selectors, but this would help us nest selectors to select children of an element. So I'll go ahead and select a div and then select a span and then try to style it and put the color to be brown. Now, once I save this, you see that we have this text here changing to brown, and then we also have this text here changing to brown. Now, why is this happening? We have a div here, and then this div has a child span here. it also has a child span here. Now, basically, what this selector does is it's looking for a span that is inside of a div. But it doesn't care how many level deep this is. You can go ahead and select it even if it's 10 levels deep. But then what this means is even if we have another span here, maybe we have a div here, and then we have another span here, and I say hello world and save this. This also gets styled with the class, the color we added to this. Now, the next selector we'll look at will be one that builds on what we currently have. But then this time around, it is selecting the first level child of an element. It has to be a direct child. If it's a nested child, then this selector would definitely not work. So here we have a div, and we're looking for a div that has a child span. It doesn't have it. Now we're looking for a div that has a child span. Now the child span must be a direct child of the div. Now when I save this, you see that this is no longer selected. Why is that so? Because here we have a div and we have a child span. So this of course gets applied. But here we have a child here where the span is now the child of this P element. So definitely this cannot be applied. But then if you look here again, we have another div which have a direct child span. So this will definitely get the color we applied. Now the next set of selectors we'll look at are sibling selectors. Now I can go ahead and say I want to select, I'll just go ahead and clear this up and save so that we'll refresh. Now I'll go ahead and move this li element up just to have this. So I can go ahead and select the class, select every li element that have the class text. When I do this, I'll put the color and say brown. When I save this, you see that it's just the first one that I selected. But then I can go ahead and say I want to select every sibling selector that is an li element. Now basically what this does is this is an li element, but I want to select every sibling. Basically this is a sibling of the ul element, but then I want to select any other element that is also a sibling, just like the one we selected, that is an li, which is what we are doing here. Now when I go ahead and save this, you see that it selects every other element that is an li that is a sibling of the selector we had, which is the li with the class of text. Now I can go ahead and say I want to select a sibling that is not an li element. That is I think this is just to be sure, this is a small element. So I can say that is a small element, and when I go ahead and save this, you see that only this element eventually gets this style. Now one thing to note is if I move this element down, maybe to the third, to become the third sibling, if I go ahead and change this to li, this would only be applied to siblings that come after the selector. It won't affect the ones that come before the selector. So if I save this, you'll see that it only affects the elements, the list item 3, because definitely this is the only li element that comes after this. Now if I move this further down and save this, no element would be affected because there's no li element that is a sibling of the current selector that comes after this. Now in terms of the specificity, if you look closely, you see that we have an element type selector, we have a class selector, and then we also have another element type selector. So when I hover on this, you see that this is now 0, 1, 2, because we have 2 element type selector and we have 1 class selector. Now I can go ahead and move this back up. I can go ahead and move this back up and then save the elements, which gives us this effect. Now, the next selector I want to look at is a direct sibling selector. This is done by just adding a plus to what we have. Now, this is similar to the last selector we looked at. Now, the major difference is this only selects the next sibling. Everything after that, it doesn't care about that. So if I go ahead and save this, you will see that it only selects the one after the element we wanted. Now, if I go ahead and move this down and save, you see that it only selects 3. Also, just like the previous selector, this only selects siblings that are after the current element. So if I move this down, it will definitely not pick up any li element after it. And of course, I can go ahead and make this the small element selector, and then it definitely selects this item. Now, this is probably another 30% of selectors you use. In total, maybe 60% of all the selectors you would ever have to use. Maybe 60 to 70% of all the selectors you would ever have to use. Now, the next set of selectors we want to look at will be pseudo class selectors. Now, go ahead and save this, so we have it clean. Now, the first pseudo class we'll be looking at would be the hover pseudo class. So we can go ahead and select all li, and then we say on hover, you can simply say let the color be brown. Now, when I go ahead and save this and come back here, if I hover on any element, the color stays the same. But of course, when I get to an li element, the color becomes brown while it's being hovered on. Now, we can go ahead and also look at the other. Now, I'll go ahead and add maybe a div here and an input, just a simple input to the type of text under. Now, this will enable us to look at pseudo classes like focus. So we can go ahead and look at on focus, let the background color be brown. Now, when I come here and click on any element or focus on any element, nothing happens. But when I come here and focus on the input element, definitely the background becomes black. This works for elements like inputs, buttons, and the rest. Now, when I can go ahead and also apply the disabled pseudo class. Now, this would show up if I come here and say this input field is disabled. The background becomes brown. Also, I can go ahead and say if this is required, then I just come here and make this required and save this, and then the background is still black. I'll just take it out and save so that you see that without this, the background is white. But once I make it required, then of course it takes the style. Now, it is important to note that there are endless pseudo classes like this that are element specific. So you might want to look up the documentation. I'll also have the Mozilla link on the description so that you can look at the various list of pseudo classes we have. Now, the next pseudo class we want to look at would be the first child pseudo class. Now, when I come here and say color should be blue, now what happens is any li that is a first child of its parents will take the color blue. When I go ahead and save this, you see that the first child here is the color blue. Now, the next selector we'll look at is the last child pseudo class. Now, when I say the last child pseudo class, basically what should happen is the li has to be the last child of its parents. Now, when I go ahead and save this, you will see that this style is not applied to any li element here. But then why is that so? If you look closely, you will see that the li element is not the last child of the parent. So all I have to do is move this li element down here and it becomes the last child of its parent. If I save this, you see that the color blue is finally applied. So it's important to understand how this works. Basically, this has to be the last child of its parent. Now, when we talk about specificity so far for what we've done, you also see that it follows the same rules as to what we've been saying from the start of this video. Basically, the first selector here is an element type selector, and the last selector here is basically under the class column. So when I hover on this, you see that you have 0, 1, 1. Basically, you have one class and then you have one element type. The same applies here. 0, 1, 1. So it's very important to know. So we can also look at the nth child. So of course we can select specific children. So we can say the nth child. We can say we want to select the first child li element. We want the second. We want the third. Now something else we can do is we can of course say we want maybe 2n. This will select every second child element. There's an li element. So when I go ahead and save this, you see that it selects this. This is the second child. The second child here, of course, this is supposed to be the fourth element, which is supposed to match our selector. But this is supposed to be the second child here, which is supposed to match our selector. But then this is not an li element, so it won't be selected. Now, if I go ahead and maybe add an extra li element here and save this, of course, this is the sixth child, so it matches, it is divisible by 2, so then it means it is selected. If I also go ahead and move this small element down here and save this, you see that this also matches. You can, of course, move this to be 3n. it will definitely select every third child. Now, you can have an offset of 2n minus 1. Basically, this selects every second child, but then with an offset of 1. So when I go ahead and save this, you see that it comes back to the first element, the third element, and then it's supposed to select this if this was an li element. I'll just quickly show that by moving this element up. And then when I save that, you see that it selects every second element, but then offsetting by 1. Same thing, you can go for the third element. Basically, the rule always applies. Next, we can look at maybe select every element that is first of type. Now, this will select every element that is the first of its type. Now, of course, this is a child of the UL element, and we have various LI elements here. But then it wants to select the first of its type. So if I go ahead and say the color here should be red, then of course, when I save this, you'll see that this is the first of its type. Now, if I go ahead and change this to be the last of type, which is another selector, last of type. Now, before I save this, if you look closely here, when we selected last child, we could not select an li element because it was not the last child of its parent. But then we are looking at last of type, which means it doesn't have to be the last child. It just has to be the last occurrence of an li element of its type, basically. So when I go ahead and save this, you see that it is selecting 5. So the next pseudo class we want to look at would be basically the not selector pseudo class. Now, basically what this does is it selects everything that it matches except whatever we have in the parentheses. So I can go ahead and say select every li element that is not a text, that doesn't have the class of text, and then I can come here and say the color should be blue. Now, when I go ahead and save this, you see that every li element on the page has the color blue except the one that has the class text. Just to except the one that has the class text. Now, the next selector we'll look at is the is selector. So I can go ahead and select the is pseudo class selector. I can say the class text. Now, basically what this will do is it selects li element that matches the selector in the parentheses. So when I go ahead and save this, you see that only the first li element is saved, or only the first li element basically matches this selection. Now, the last we'll look at is the has pseudo class selector. Now, the has pseudo class selector is different because this selects an element relative to another element in its environment or in its surrounding. So here I can say I want to select an element, an li element that has a child or a sibling, that has a sibling that is a small tag. Now, when I go ahead and save this, you see that this li elements will be selected. So when I go ahead and save this, you see that every li element here is selected. Again, just to make this very clear, the has selector is special because it only selects an element based on another element in its surrounding. So I'm only selecting an li element when something else that is not an li element, which is the small tag, is on the web page. Now, basically, it has a sibling that is a small tag. So when I save this is applied. But then I can go ahead and say I want to select an li that have a class of text, and then that has a sibling that is a small element. So when I save this, you see that it selects only the first one. Now, to make this even more complicated, I can go ahead and remove this and add another pseudo selector, a pseudo class selector here, and say text. Now, basically what this reads is I want to select an li element that is not or does not have a class of text on it, but then it has a sibling that is a small element. Now, all of these have siblings that is a small element, but then they don't have the class of text. So of course, it's supposed to select all of them except the first one. So when I go ahead and save this, you see that every other element is affected except the first one, and then of course except the small element. Now, 90% of the time, you might never have to do something like this, but this is just to expand our knowledge and understand that this is actually limitless, and we can do this as much as we understand what the implications are. Now, something else I want to point our attention to is, remember we said when we talk about pseudo class selectors like the not, the has, and the is. Now, they don't necessarily add scores to when it comes to specificity, but then the element inside of them is also added as a score. So if you look at this closely, you see that we have an li element here, we have a not selector, but then inside of the not selector, we have a text class, which is weighted a 1. So we already have a 1 in the last column for element type. We have a 1 in the middle column for a class. And then the has selector has a small has small inside, which is a small element type, and this small element type basically is an element type selector, which is also a 1. So I expect this to be a 0, 1, 2. So when I hover on this, you see that this is a 0, 1, 2 because it basically has two element type selector and one class selector. The has and the not don't necessarily add to the weight or the score, but then whatever is inside of them is also added. This is just basically a form of nesting. Now, the last pseudo class selector we want to look at is the where pseudo class selector. Now, basically what this is saying is just basically this looks like the other ones we've used earlier. So I can say I want to select an li element where the class of text is present, and then I can go ahead and say let the color be brown. Now, when I save this, you see that the first element, the color is brown because, of course, the first element has a class of text. Now, you might wonder what is different from the where selector and the is or the has or the not selector. But then if I bring our memory back to the chart I showed us earlier, you see that the where selector is a no value selector. It adds absolutely no value. So regardless of what is in the parentheses, the value would definitely not change. So if I come back here, you will see that this is basically going to just be a 001 because the class that is inside the where pseudo class does not add any weight or value. So it's still just going to be a 001. So when I hover on this, you see that this is a 001 as compared to when I have something like the is selector. If I go ahead and save this, we have the same result. But then when I hover on this, you see that this is a 011. Now, what is the implication? The where pseudo class selector is very special. It's often encouraged for people that build libraries. Now, what this means is whenever your library is being used, this class would easily be overridden. I can come here and say li color should be blue. You will see that this would override this because, of course, the weight is now equal and then this comes last. And in case of a library, of course, the user style is always going to come last, which means the user style would be applied because the user style would always come last. So this is really important for those that are building libraries and want to style elements so that they can easily be overridden by the users of that library. So I think that's all we'll cover for pseudo element classes. Now, the next set of selectors we want to look at will be the pseudo element selectors. Now, to show this, we will just demonstrate the before and the after pseudo element selector. So we can just go ahead and select maybe the class of text, and then we say text before. We can say content. You always have to set the content to have this applied, and then we can say background color should be red or purple. So when I go ahead and save this, you see that for every text on the page, before that we add a pseudo before element. Same thing applies for the after element. When I go ahead and save this, you see that for every text on the page, you have the after element. So I'll just go ahead and take this class off as we don't need it here. And I'll also take it off here as I believe we don't need it here, just to see what we are doing clearly. But I'll just give us a short practical use case of the pseudo before element. Here I can go ahead and change this to logged in user, just for this to make more sense. Here I can just go ahead and leave the content to be empty, but of course you have to set the content property. I can go ahead and say height to be 2 pixels, to be 5 pixels, width to be 5 pixels, border radius should be 50%. Now, once I do this, I would just come here and select the element itself and say position relative. This is just to enable me make this an absolute position, positioned element. So I can come here and say position absolute. I can go ahead and say top 6 pixels and then left minus 5 pixels. And I can say background color should be green, yellow green. Now I can just quickly come here and say padding left of 5 pixels. Now once I save this, you see what we have. It just looks like basically a login flag for the user. So this is typically a use case we can have for the before and the after pseudo element type. Now, in terms of the score, the before pseudo element definitely is a 001, the one on the last column, because it's an element, it's a pseudo element type selector. So here, if you look at this, we have a class selector and then we have a pseudo element type selector. So here, if you look at it, we have a class selector and a pseudo element type selector. So if I hover on this, we should have 0, 1, 1, which is exactly what we have. Now, the next type of selector we want to look at would be attribute selector. So I can come here and just quickly add an attribute to this and say data welcome. And all I have to do is come here and put it in a block bracket and say data welcome and say I want the color to be brown. Now, once I save this, you see that the color has successfully been changed to brown. Now, we can even go ahead and give it a value and say true. Now, if I come here and save this, definitely it will still be selected because we have the key, which is what we are looking for. So I can go ahead and say equal to true. And then when I save this, you see that it's still selected, but maybe I just take off the E here and save this. You see that it's no longer selected. So I can bring this back. Now, something else we can also do is we come here and say, put the caret sign, which basically signifies start with. So I can come here and take this off and say, we want an attribute selector that basically starts, that's data welcome that starts with a T. So when I save this, you see that it's still selected, but I can go ahead and say X here. And when I save this, it's no longer selected because, of course, it starts with a T. Now, something else we can do, we can say it ends with a dollar sign. If I say ends with a T and save this, you see that it's no longer selected, but of course it ends with an E. So this would definitely help us select our element. Or we could also have a wildcard here. When we do this, basically we are saying, maybe I have a Z here. When I say you are basically saying anywhere in the value, we should have the character Z. So if I go ahead and change this to E, you'll see that it is now being selected. I think this is most likely most of the selectors you would ever need or ever need to work with when you're working with CSS selectors. Of course, there are others, but I don't necessarily think they are important, so there was no point covering them. Now, in terms of the score, of course, attribute selectors, from the examples I gave here, attribute selectors are definitely on the top, on the middle column, which would definitely add a 1 to the middle column. So if I hover on this, you see that this is a 010, so which means it's really strong, just like the class selector. So for most of the use cases, these are the selectors you would ever really need when working with CSS. But of course, you can also go to the Mozilla Developer Network to look at other selectors we have there. The list is endless, especially when it comes to pseudo-classes. So you can definitely go through the list and see if there's any other specific selector you want. But like I mentioned earlier, for most use cases, these are all the selectors you might ever really need when it comes to styling CSS. Now, one last thing to look at is there's a last diagram I have here. I would also attach a link to this chart on the description. Now, here we have inline styles. When we talk about inline styles, basically, inline styles are the most specific style. So whenever we apply an inline style, it's definitely the most specific style, and the browser is always going to pick that. Now, when we bring inline styles into the equation, it basically just adds an extra column to the left hand side for us. So basically we now have a one here as inline style selector. We have the ID selector, we have the class selector, and lastly we have element type selectors. The only things that can override, or the only thing that can override an inline style is basically the only thing that can override an inline style is basically the important flag or the important keyword, basically adding the important keyword. But then, of course, this is bad practice because imagine you are having to do this when you don't really understand why your styles are not being applied. And then you have to apply a different style it's at a later point, or somebody else is working on the code base and having to apply a different style. No matter what they do, that style would never be applied, no matter how specific they make their selectors, because of what you have done by using the important flag. And then you end up having to use the important flag everywhere possible, which makes the code really difficult to debug when issues like this arises. And trust me, this would be 99.9% of all the selectors you would ever need. Thank you for staying to the end. I hope you now know most of the CSS selectors out there and their implication in terms of specificity. Also, I have two videos linked, one for customizing React Select and the other for creating React app without using the create React app command. This would help you optimize your React application and also help you understand how React works under the hood. With that being said, don't forget that tech is a journey and the idea is to take steps every day. Kindly like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.